So here we are. Britain has asked the European Union for an extension to Brexit, but it is not clear what they're about to say in response. We're expecting press conferences any minute now. The scene is set for a crisis, MPs indicating that they still won't back the PM's deal, Theresa May insisting that she won't ask for a long extension, and the EU currently saying nothing except that they might convene an emergency summit next week. In Britain, over 1 million people have signed a petition in the last 24 hours calling for Article 50 to be revoked, a possibility that Jeremy Corbyn refused to rule out earlier. This is how the day unfolded here. Theresa May came to Brussels to boogie like a Remainer with her bosom buddy Angela Merkel. So much for the fantasy, so much for the mask. The real Theresa May makes the red carpet look like the plank. Lonelier than ever and friendless at home, she came begging for a political bailout, an extension of Article 50, which under the rules, every one of these member flags can veto. Never has Britain been less in control, and never has she.
What matters is that we recognise that Brexit is the decision of the British people. We need to deliver on that. We're nearly 3 years on from the original vote. It is now the time for Parliament to decide. A short extension gives us that opportunity to decide to leave the European Union, to deliver on that result of that referendum. And I sincerely hope that will be with a negotiated deal.
Is this your last question, Prime Minister?
Will you accept no deal, Prime Minister? Will it be your fault if you leave with no deal?
The echo of questions will follow her all the way into the history books. Despite the glint in the glass, the mood here has shifted from thin hope to thick despair. Would you be prepared to sanction a longer delay of Article 50 if that meant avoiding a no-deal Brexit?
Well, this is a hypothetical question in a hypothetical situation.
It's all hypothetical at the moment.
Yes. No.
But we still need answers.
There is one reality now, which is a letter by Theresa May asking for an extension if the British Parliament would vote yes next week to the deal. I think today, if the British Parliament would say yes, lock, stock and barrel, to the whole thing on the table.
But even the table is missing, and if has become a very big word. And what happens if the deal is voted down in the House of Commons next week? Would you allow Britain to crash out without a deal?
But I hope that if there is a positive vote next week, so that we have a deal. The deal has been
But there may not be a positive vote. It really doesn't look like.
If there is no positive vote, we go in the direction of a no deal, yes.
And you're prepared to put up with that? You're prepared for that eventuality?
Yes.
We are not the damage that will inflict.
Yeah, exactly. You start again last every time. We are not the bad guys in that story. You are not the bad guys neither. But
Who is the bad guy in the story, out of interest?
The people who told to the voters that Brexit would be something which would happen like that would be no consequence. If there wouldn't be any consequence, and if there would be no interest for the UK to keep connected to the European Union, this would have been done in 2 weeks. We are speaking since months and years now about this exit strategy, and so it's all the people who lied before are responsible.
Plenty of bad blood, and it was left to President Macron to put the boot in.
We do respect what the Prime Minister and the Parliament are making, but we have to be clear. We can discuss and agree on an extension, if this is a technical extension, in case of a yes vote on the agreement we negotiated during 2 years. In case of no vote or no, directly, it will guide everybody to a no deal, for sure.
They really want to get off Brexit and talk about all the other stuff that matters. Huddling with a club that will miss her and her country less and less. Mrs. May's Gallic shrug of resignation was about the only thing not lost in translation today. And guess who? Like a matinee surprise in another building, Jeremy Corbyn, the man who hopes to walk on the red carpet soon. He's just spent an hour with Michel Barnier and Commission bigwigs, promising to deliver where Theresa May has failed.
We do believe we can construct a majority which will prevent the crashing out and all the chaos that will come from crashing out, and that is what we're absolutely focused on.
What makes you think you can do it this time when you've not been able to do it before?
We got a lot nearer last time than we did on previous occasions, and there's obviously a great concentration of minds in the British Parliament at the moment because of the, I think, danger of crashing out without a deal.
A concentration of minds, more like a confederacy of despair. Whatever the length of the extension agreed today and possibly revised next week at another summit, bad memories of Brexit will linger in this club long after the doors have shut. Now, they are still debating the timetable behind those closed doors that you just saw, and we were originally going to have a press conference with Donald Tusk an hour ago and then a press conference with Theresa May. That has been pushed back, certainly until now. We're just hearing, actually, from the Irish Times that it might have been pushed back a couple of hours. So who knows what's really going on. Let's bring in my guest, Vice President of the European Parliament, Mairead McGuinness. It's very confusing, isn't it? What do you think is going on?
I'm not so sure that I know, but I think things are changing because we had these various dates. The Prime Minister looking for 30th of May, Europe offering 30th of June, yeah. Europe offering the 22nd of May. And now I'm hearing different dates earlier in May. I'm not so sure that that matters much.
Does it make any difference?
No, but I'm wondering, is there something else going on inside that room? There are 2 or 3 scenarios likely next week. One, the withdrawal agreement gets through, and then everything else falls into place. Right. I think the question that perhaps is difficult to answer, what happens if it doesn't? Do we see a 4th meaningful vote, or do we then have a scenario where both the Prime Minister needs to look at a different timeline, or she goes for a no-deal Brexit? Nobody wants that. Maybe in that room they're discussing the consequences of the withdrawal agreement not getting through the House of Commons a 3rd time. And that's why this is going on much longer than people had anticipated. I heard the word special configuration. I don't know what they mean. So I think that things are unfolding here. And maybe there is wisdom in trying to have different scenarios depending on how things go in the House of Commons, so that we're not shocked and unprepared for a no vote again, and that we have some sight of another option rather than no deal, which the House of Commons doesn't want.
Talking of shocked and unprepared, the impression that I really got here quite strongly for the first time, in these buildings, is that European leaders are now reckoning that a no-deal scenario, even if they're saying the opposite, is the most likely scenario, but also that they think that she has pivoted towards the Brexiteers in her own party, that for her that is more important because of internal polling than trying to save the deal.
Well, 2 points there. In terms of the internal issues for the Conservative Party, I think a lot of people have a sense in which David Cameron tried with the referendum to heal the rifts, and perhaps the Prime Minister is also trying to hold her party together. I mean, there are bigger issues than that in my view, because Brexit would be such a sundering if it goes wrong of relationships and bad for everybody, that I think it is unthinkable that we would allow that to happen. When you ask about the no-deal scenario, I think, yes, European leaders are preparing for the worst. We have to, because if the withdrawal
expecting
agreement,
the worst?
Well, perhaps you're better expect it and hope it doesn't happen, but be prepared. If you look at what might happen if there is a vote Monday, and we don't know when the vote might happen, if it goes down, if we were ill-prepared, it would be a disaster for our citizens. It will be difficult anyway, but we're better have our ducks in the row should things go wrong. And I think the UK should have the ducks in a row if it goes wrong.
And because of geography, Britain and Ireland are joined at the hip on this one, aren't they? So if we go out with a no deal, that's really bad news for Ireland, because all those things that you didn't want to happen might happen as a result.
Well, I think it's bad news for both of us. I think we're near neighbours, we're friends, so that would not be a good sign.
How
in terms
worried are you?
of, I mean, of course I'm worried. I represent a constituency that's close to Northern Ireland, so we are very determined to keep, if you like, things as they are today, whatever happens. But that would be very difficult in a no-deal scenario. I think the British Prime Minister knows that. She's also, with her tariff arrangements recently, indicated that we don't want to see any physical infrastructure. So yes, we're very worried. Of course Ireland would suffer, but I do have to say this. I think there's a sense from the UK that we would be suffering more than you would. This would really be bad for your consumers, bad for your food supply chain, bad for business. So I don't think it's in anyone's interest to go that far, even though at this moment that is the scenario we face.
Is there a sense in this city that European leaders, that you, have run out of patience with Theresa May?
Look, Donald Tusk said there's Brexit fatigue. I don't think there's lack of patience, because I think in politics, if you don't have patience, you shouldn't be in the job. You need a lot of it, a bit like journalists. So we have to be patient. I think there is fatigue, but Donald Tusk rightly reminds us that we can't allow ourselves rest, because there is no time for that. And however impatient we might be, or tick-tock, 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 we're at that moment now that I think to give in to fatigue at this stage would be to fail the people we represent. And I hope the Prime Minister has reserves of energy that she needs to get this over the line, to get Brexit sorted in an orderly way, perhaps even to look for a longer extension. Who knows?
Who knows? It's a bit of a nail-biter, that's for sure.
It is a nail-biter, indeed.
Mairead McGuinness, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. Now, the Prime Minister May's statement last night blaming MPs for not backing her Brexit deal caused huge turmoil in Westminster today. Furious MPs accused the Prime Minister of being contemptuous of Parliament and even endangering MPs. Downing Street denied that charge, but many believe the Prime Minister may have worsened her chances of winning a meaningful vote next week. So how is next week going to pan out? Let's go over to our political editor, Gary Gibbon in Westminster. Gary.
One Cabinet Minister who's close to the heart of the Brexit story said to me today that the possibilities of no deal were very real and rising. This particular Cabinet Minister talked about the possibility that if Britain were to crash out of the EU next week, there would be a very, very tiny sort of courtesy extension up to the 11th of April that would be all that was on offer from the EU, enough to sort of tidy up a few mini agreements before no deal itself. To understand, I think, just how dramatic events are getting, you do need to peer into the crystal ball for next week. If we have the meaningful vote next week, and the odds at the moment look like it would not do very well for Theresa May at all, partly because of that broadcast last night, but partly for other reasons that are well established, you could then move into a whole load of different votes that could happen in the House of Commons that could be trying to stop Brexit, revoke it or stop it with a second referendum, or which could be trying to move to a softer Brexit. But those votes might not pass, and even if they did pass, the government might think that it didn't have to pick them up and pursue them. There's another vote that's being talked about, though, tonight, and that, because the Prime Minister has raised the prospect of her deal or no deal, is a vote of no confidence. If her deal goes down, it is very possible that the Leader of the Opposition might feel that's the moment to reach for a vote of no confidence. It only requires now, remember, just a handful of Tory MPs to change sides, and that vote of no confidence passes 2 days before the Brexit deadline. If you thought this week was pretty alarming and rudderless, well, next week, viewers of a nervous disposition really might want to look away.
When the Trades Union and Congress chief and the CBI chief tour the studios together with a joint stark warning, you know you're in very dangerous terrain.
So we are joined with the TUC today. It's very unusual, but we've set our differences aside to come together to say this is a national emergency and we need to change course.
Last night's statement to the nation by the Prime Minister, in which she made a direct attack on MPs, did nothing to calm nerves in Westminster.
Or do they not want to leave at all, causing potentially irreparable damage to public trust, not just in this generation of politicians, but to our entire democratic process?
I think she probably has made life more difficult for herself, because many MPs will feel, why is she passing all the blame on us? We didn't negotiate this deal, she did.
In Chippenham in Wiltshire today, strong echoes from some of the Prime Minister's attack. There's no guarantee that'll help to deliver the vote.
I think a lot of the MPs are to blame for the hassle that she's had, because I don't feel that she's got the backing.
I think people's going to vote with their feet very soon.
By doing what?
Not voting for them, voting them out, every one of them. I think they'll be looking for a brand new party.
MPs are equally to blame as the Prime Minister. But at the end of the day, the Prime Minister is the Prime Minister, and she should be leading from the front.
The tone of the attack on MPs sparked cross words in the Commons.
One of the most contemptuous statements that I've ever heard, and that's up against some pretty stiff competition. Could I now ask the Leader of the House again if she agrees with what the Prime Minister said last night?
Leader of the House, this is not... I will... Order, let's grow up. Do grow up. For goodness sake, this is not a matter of party political hackery.
Mr. Speaker, may I just say that your response does not raise the level, but I'll leave it there.
Order, resume your seat, Leader of the House. My response sets out the constitutional position that has applied to members of the House of Commons over generations.
Just before that TV statement to the nation, Theresa May invited nearly 20 Tory MPs into her office in the Commons. Many of them told her her time was nearly up.
You saw her last night. Is authority virtually gone?
Well, she's still the Prime Minister, and everybody was courteous, but and I do, and I've always said this, I always admire her Zebedee-like qualities, jumping out and being resilient, but I felt it was a different Prime Minister that we saw
shrunken
last night. I felt she inevitably, she looked exhausted and anxious by events, and I want her to be not someone who's swept by the events, but actually lead the events.
So that moment may already have passed.
Well, we're going to find that out next week.
We asked an expert on the EU and an expert on the British Constitution how a momentous week ahead could pan out. After Theresa May's statement on Monday, the government could hold the meaningful vote on Tuesday, and it's expected to fail. Indicative votes could follow on Wednesday, in which support for a customs union, joining the single market, a second referendum, a long extension to Brexit might all be tested.
The Prime Minister said in Prime Minister's questions yesterday that if the House rejected her deal again on a meaningful vote, it would be for the House to decide what happened next. So it suggests as though she's going to give it over to the House. But the government isn't bound to follow a motion. It's just political pressure to do that. So
and the pressure could be quite hard, because I think if the government said it wanted to pursue no deal or drifted towards no deal, there'd be a motion of no confidence put forward by the opposition. Quite a lot of Tories would vote for it, the government would fall. So I don't think Parliament would allow a government to proceed towards no deal.
Thursday we've got the European Council sitting there, a jury in judgment, and gives us 2 or 3 weeks to manage us towards no deal. And they think there is a serious possibility that that is where things are heading.
The issue of how bad would no deal be, there are clearly nuances amongst them, or even worse than nuances, quite bad divisions. The French, the Spanish, some others are giving us the impression they're quite relaxed about no deal. It might even be a good thing to get shot of us. But other countries, particularly Ireland, but also Germany, the Nordics, the Baltics, the Poles, we would give anything to keep the British in if they could. They'd be happy to have a long extension, so in the hope that the British might change their mind and have another referendum.
Friday should have been a day's holiday for Parliament, but it could be one of the most important days in recent British political history.
I think that sort of Friday could be a very sort of long, maybe not so good Friday that we face as the UK comes to terms with whatever has come out of that European summit.
The stopwatch could really be on Friday.
I
in
wouldn't
a way
be surprised.
That seems unimaginable.
And maybe that on Friday, Parliament may face some pretty unpalatable choices given to it by the European Council the day before. And Parliament may have to decide to accept something that many of its MPs don't want to do in order to avoid no deal. That may be a very dangerous and difficult day for everybody.
Some MPs are finding getting clarity from the Prime Minister on the stark choices ahead isn't an easy task.
Do you think she actually knows, hand on heart, what happens the other side of defeat next week?
No. I have to say I feel very dispirited and unsure of where we're being led.
One face of Parliament's most famous symbol was uncovered today. The secrets of how this crisis unfurls are unknowable.
Gary Gibbon in Westminster. As we heard, the trade unions and CBI joined forces today to warn that the UK is facing a national emergency. They have written to the Prime Minister demanding that a Plan B is drawn up to avoid a no-deal departure in 8 days' time. Carolyn Fairbairn, Director General of the Confederation of British Industry, and Francis O'Grady, the General Secretary of the TUC, are here in the studio. How big a national emergency? I mean, it's pretty rare for anyone to talk about a national, but for the two of you, how big?
Well, I think that we're hearing what a political crisis is. It's an economic crisis as well. I've been with businesses this week talking about their preparations for no deal. They are not ready. The impact on our economy of a no-deal Brexit would be a wrecking ball for ordinary people's lives. It's why we're here together. We're talking about people's jobs and lives. So the paramount importance now is to avoid no deal. And it will take compromise, leadership from the front, which is why we're here together today.
I mean, one of the issues here, which is rather sad in a way, because many of your members will have voted to leave, particularly in the north and the more deprived areas of the country. It's a very, very confusing picture.
We know that, in fact, a majority of people at work and 6 in 10 trade unionists voted Remain. But that means that we've got 40% who voted Leave. But I think what's important is that whichever way you voted, we don't want working people ending up having to pay the price for a mess that I think the Prime Minister has got to prioritise clearing up. And we've been very clear, rule out no deal, extend Article 50, but come up with and start listening to MPs who could command a majority around a different deal.
Do you believe that Theresa May is the right person to be managing this crisis, this national emergency?
I think she's shown, if I'm honest, a tin ear to concerns that have been expressed. She seems to be a broken record and keeps pushing a deal that suffered a historic defeat, a thumping defeat on the second round. I think she needs to know when to recognise that that deal is not going to get through. But she needs to start speaking up for the country as a whole, not just the European Research Group on her back benches. But, you know, we've got people in Honda a week on Saturday demonstrating to defend their plant. I'm not saying Brexit's the whole story, but it's a big part of it. And that uncertainty is putting livelihoods at risk.
I mean, as Monsieur Macron suggested, the truth is it seems that she's battling to keep her party together rather than the country together.
Well, I think that the country has to now absolutely come first. And the red lines that have been laid out need to be revisited to be able to create
that compromise. Viewers won't remember what red lines are.
Well, they were in blood early on, and they have prevented a compromise being reached. Now, business has actually been absolutely clear that they want to make Brexit work. They are not trying to fight Brexit, but they are trying to create an environment where they can continue to trade, they can grow, they can succeed, and that's the national interest that we're talking about here today.
Well, I mean, does Mrs May have to pledge that she will not tolerate a no deal?
We think so. We think so. If you
Both
look,
of you.
It's clearly reckless. And, you know, this isn't a political game. This is about people's jobs, their livelihoods, their rights at work. These things matter to people. It shouldn't be something to use as a threat or to try and bully people into voting for a deal that is going down. Instead, we need to find a new deal that prioritises jobs and workers' rights.
This is sort of civil society calling now through you. I mean, to get the country back on track?
Well, I think that what we have all been doing is we've been listening to what businesses have been saying, and I speak to so many now who've got plans in their bottom drawer for supply chains that move out of the UK, for factories that they will close. Those voices have to be heard now. That's why we're talking about emergency, and it is about leading from the front. That's why we've written to the Prime Minister herself. We think she can and must, over the next few days, change course and start bringing compromise in Parliament and lead the country out of this.
So, I mean, if we fall out next Friday, or not much later than that, what is the effect?
I don't think she'll be able to blame MPs for that. I think she's got a direct and personal responsibility. She's the elected Prime Minister of this country. A way forward could be found. We know that's possible. She's got to give MPs the opportunity to take those indicative votes, to try and craft a consensus and a compromise way forward that is a good deal for ordinary people.
We're not sure compromise is in her vocabulary.
But only 4% of businesses we've asked have said they're ready for no deal. It will be chaos, and it will be about people's jobs and lives.
And what do you make of what's going on in Brussels at the moment? I mean, they do seem extremely frustrated with us.
Well, I think that is enormously alarming to hear the emotion in people's voices, to see the febrile atmosphere. I think that concerns business even more. And that's why we need the leadership that can cut through that and get us out of this mess.
Well, thank you both very, very warmly. It's very rare to have the CBI and the TUC in the studio at the one time, so thank you both. Let's get some reaction now from MPs. A Labour MP and chair of the House of Commons Brexit Committee, Hilary Benn, is in Westminster, and in his constituency of Welwyn-Hatfield is Conservative MP Grant Shapps. Grant Shapps, could I just ask you first, is Mrs May going to win the vote next week?
Almost certainly not. 4 or 5 things would have to come together. Obviously, winning over the Speaker to allow her to do it. She'll probably get there because the EU will give her a piece of paper to allow that to happen, some legal document. Then the DUP, then some of the ERGers who might follow the DUP, then probably 15 to 20 Labour MPs. She only won 3 of them last time. And then I think there's a group of another quite significant sized group who'll say they won't support her deal unless there's a different negotiating team doing the future agreement. So that's a lot of ifs before you get to a yes with that deal.
Hilary Benn, you could hear the things which are going on in Brussels, and I'm wondering, therefore, if she doesn't win next week, what happens?
Well, the European Council will meet again, it seems, next Thursday. But this is a full-blown national crisis, which, with a government that is rudderless, that is living a hand-to-mouth existence. And the first priority, because in a crisis you need to work out what is the most urgent thing to do. And the first priority, for the sake of the nation, is to ensure that we get an extension. And therefore, if the EU offers the UK an extension, if it involves having to take part in European Parliament elections, then I think it needs to be accepted by the Prime Minister. The fact she asked for a short one, when previously the Deputy Prime Minister had warned that a short one-off extension would be damaging and reckless, I don't think that rises to the scale of the task.
What is a realistic one? How will viewers know that some decent date has been achieved?
Well, which brings me on to the second priority, which is to enable Parliament, John, to begin to see whether there is an alternative approach which can command a majority. For 2 3/4 years, the government has failed to reach out across the House of Commons. It has failed to try and create consensus. The Prime Minister laid out her red lines and she has refused to move an inch. And a group of us as cross-party MPs have put down an amendment for Monday to give us the chance on Wednesday to start that process. But indicative votes are only relevant if we have ensured that we do not crash out with no deal on Friday.
Well, Grant Shapps, I mean, there is talk of a vote of confidence next week. Do you expect such a thing? And do you believe, as an MP, that MPs will take back control next week?
Well, on the first point, obviously it's up to the leader of the opposition or any other party if they want to call a vote of no confidence. I suspect that still wouldn't pass, despite some of the murmurings following the Prime Minister's speech last night that Conservatives would somehow support it. I certainly wouldn't. I don't expect others would. And, you know, on the second part of it, if you think this has been a mess, which clearly it has been, the last several months with an executive, a cabinet, a government running the business of the House, if not controlling the outcome of the votes, you wait till you see what it's like when Parliament itself takes control, if that was what was to happen. For the simple reason, I was speaking to Oliver Letwin, who I know has been working with Hilary and others on motions to try and achieve this, and it's quite possible, we both think, that there isn't a majority in Parliament for any given Brexit outcome. So the idea that giving the power to Parliament will solve it is quite simply untrue. I think it will make us even more rudderless than today, which is a frightening thought.
Well, Grant Shapps and Hilary Benn, thank you both very much indeed. I hope bringing you out into the outdoors hasn't taken more of your voice away.
Oh, you're very kind. I'd just say, John, Parliament could hardly do a worse job than the government has managed over the last few weeks.
Hilary Benn, thank you very much indeed.